6 weeks in bed, you'd expect to feel wobbly when you tried to walk. Up on the platform, you didn't even use energy to stand up. We didn't realize it, but we were living like invalids. We'll get our strength back, but next time we'll take measures. Huh, take a trip to Mars in free fall, and by the time a guy got there, his muscles would be so flabby he couldn't stand up in half-gravity. Something's got to be done about that, Joe. Joe said somberly, "Something's got to be done about spaceships before that comes up again." Somebody appeared with a tray. There was food on it, smoking hot food. Joe looked at it and knew that his appetite, anyhow, was back to Earth normal. "Thanks," he mumbled appreciatively, and attacked the food. Mike drank his coffee. Then he said, "Joe, do you know anything about powder metallurgy?" Joe shrugged. It hurt. Powder metallurgy. Yes, I've seen it used, at my father's plant. They've made small precision parts with it. Why? "Do you know if anybody ever made a weld with it?" asked Mike. Joe chewed. Then he said, "I think so, yes. At the plant they did. They had trouble getting the surfaces properly cleaned for welding, but they managed it. Why?" "One more question," said Mike tensely. "How much Portland cement is used to make a cubic yard of concrete?" "I wouldn't know," admitted Joe. "Why? What's all this about?" "Haney and the chief. Those two big apes have been kidding me, as long as they could stay awake, for what happened to me when I landed. Those infernal savages," Mike seethed. "They got my clothes off, and they had me smeared all over with butter, and 4011 necklaces around my neck, and flowers in my hair. They thought I was some kind of heathen god. Hanuman, somebody told me. The Hindu monkey god." He raged. "And those two big apes think it's funny. Joe, I never knew I knew all the words for the cussings I gave those heathen before our fellas found me. And Haney and the chief will drive me crazy if I can't slap 'em down. Powder metallurgy does the trick, from what you told me. That's okay, then." He stood up and stalked toward the front of the plane. Joe roused himself with an effort. He turned to look about him. Haney lay slumped in a reclining chair on the other side of the plane cabin. His eyes were closed. The chief lay limply in another chair. He smiled faintly at Joe, but he didn't try to talk. He was too tired. The return to normal gravity bothered him, as it did Joe. Joe looked out the window. In neat, geometric spacing on either side of the transport there were fighter jets. There was another flight above and farther away. Joe saw, suddenly, a peeling off of planes from the farther formation. They dived down through the clouds. He never knew what they went to look for, or what they found. He went groggily back to his bunk in a strange and embarrassing weakness. He woke when the plane landed. He didn't know where it might be. It was, he knew, an island. He could see the wide, sun-baked white of the runways. He could see seabirds in clouds over at the edge. The plane trundled and lurched slowly to a stop. A service truck came growling up, and somebody led cables from it up into the engines. Somebody watched dials and waved a hand. There was silence. There was stillness. Joe heard voices and footsteps. Presently he heard the dull booming of surf. The plane seemed to wait for a very long time. Then there was a faint, distant whine of jets, and a plane came from the east. It was first a dot, and then a vague shape, and then an infinitely graceful dark object which swooped down and landed at the other end of the strip. It came taxiing up alongside the transport ship and stopped. An officer in uniform climbed out, waved his hand, and walked over to the transport. He climbed up the ladder, and the pilot and the co-pilot followed him. They took their places. The door closed. One by one, the jets chugged, then roared to life. The officer talked to the pilot and co-pilot for a moment, then came down the aisle toward Joe. Mike the midget regarded him suspiciously. The plane stirred. The newly arrived officer said pleasantly, "The Navy Department sent me out here, Kenmore, to be briefed on what you know and to do a little briefing in return." The transport plane turned clumsily and began to taxi down the runway. It jolted and bumped over the tarmac, then lifted, and Joe saw that the island was nearly all airfield. There were a few small buildings and distance-dwarfed hangars. Beyond the field proper there was a ring of white surf. That was all. The rest was ocean. "I haven't much briefing to do," admitted Joe. Then he looked at the briefcase the other man opened. It had sheets and sheets of paper in it, hundreds it seemed. They were filled with questions. He'd be called on to find answers for most of them, and to admit he didn't know the answers to the rest. When he was through with this questioning, every possible useful fact he knew would be on file for future use. And now he wryly recognized that this was part payment for the efficiency and speed with which the Navy had trailed them on their landing, and for the use of a transport plane to take them back to the United States. "I'll try to answer what I can," he said cautiously, "but what are you to brief me about?" "That you're not back on Earth yet," said the officer curtly, pulling out the first sheaf of questions. "Officially, you haven't even started back. Ostensibly, you're still on the platform." Joe blinked at him. "If your return were known," continued the lieutenant, "the public would want to make heroes of you. First space travelers and so on. They'd want you on television, all of you, telling about your adventures and your return. Inevitably, what happened to your ship would leak out. And if the public knew you'd been waylaid and shot down, there'd be demands that the government take violent action to avenge the attack. It'd be something like the tumult over the sinking of the Maine, or the Lusitania, or even Pearl Harbor. It's much better for your return to be a secret for now." Joe said wryly, "I don't think any of us want to be ridden around to have ticker tape dumped on us. That part's all right. I'm sure the others will agree." "Good. One more difficulty. We had 2 spaceships. Now we have none. Our most likely enemies haven't only been building rockets, they've got a space fleet coming along. Intelligence just found out they're nearly ready for trial trips. They've been yelling to high heaven that we were building a space fleet to conquer the world. We weren't, they were, and it looks very much as if they may have beaten us." The lieutenant got out the dreary mass of papers, intended to call for every conscious or unconscious observation Joe might have made in space. It was the equivalent of the interviews extracted from flyers after a bombing raid, and it was necessary, but Joe was very tired. Wearily, he said, "Start your questions. I'll try to answer them." They arrived in Bootstrap some 46 hours after the crashing of their ship. Joe, at least, had slept nearly 30 of those hours. So while he was still wobbly on his feet, and would be for days to come, his disposition was vastly improved. There was nobody waiting on the airfield by the town of Bootstrap, but as they landed, a black car came smoothly out and stopped close by the transport. Joe got down and climbed into it. Sally Holt was inside. She took both his hands and cried, and he was horribly embarrassed when the chief came blundering into the car after him. But the chief growled, "If he didn't kiss you, Sally, I'm gonna kick his pants for him." He did," said Sally, gulping. "And I'm glad you're back, Chief. And Haney, and Mike." Mike grinned as he climbed in the back, too. Haney crowded in after him. They filled the rear of the car entirely. It started off swiftly across the field, swerving to the roadway that led to the highway out of Bootstrap to the shed. It sped out that long white concrete ribbon, and the desert was abruptly all around them. Far ahead, the great round half-dome of the shed looked like a cherry pit on the horizon. "It's good to be back," said the chief warmly. "I feel like I weigh a ton, but it's good to be back. Mike's the only one who is happier out yonder. He figures he belongs there. I've got a story to tell you, Sally." "Chief!" said Mike fiercely. "Shut up!" "Won't," said the chief amiably. "Sally, this guy Mike—" Mike went pale. "You're too big to kill," he said bitterly, "but I'll try it." The chief